Where would the PS1 be without its RPGs? It'd no doubt still be a massive seller thanks to bandicoots, clones and half-pipes, but half the cultural institution it is today, we're not so sure. The original PlayStation saw some RPG releases from the very beginning, including Beyond the Beyond, but it wasn't until Final Fantasy VII became a killer app for the PS1 that publishers began releasing a slew of RPGs for the console. We're talking about 400 plus titles, with at least a couple dozen being among the best PlayStation 1 games overall. If you thought Animal Crossing created a lot of cozy clones, you will not believe how influential Final Fantasy VII was for a whole genre. With how long games take to make these days, this will simply never happen again. Obviously, Square Enix, then simply known as Square, dominates any list that talks about the best RPGs on the PS1, but you'd be surprised just how many different sorts of RPGs they made, to say nothing of the extraordinary games from working designs Capcom, Konami, and even Sony themselves. RPGs had a golden age on this console, and is it fair to say that it's never been quite this exciting or varied in the years since? Maybe on the PS2, but we'll get to that. So let's celebrate this weird, wonderful and expansively deep piece of PS1 history with a look at the 20 best PS1 RPGs of all time. Number 20, Diablo. A hit on PCs in 1997, Diablo coming to the PlayStation was a pretty big deal in 1998. While the iconic action RPG series didn't offer online multiplayer like its PC brethren, it did offer players a pretty complete experience in the Kingdom of Kandurus. The PS1 port even threw in some fun features unique to the release, including a more zoomed in view of the action, environmental effects, and even the ability to speed up travel from one destination to the next. With the release of Diablo 4 in 2023, you might be tempted to revisit the classics when the series was still good. Go for it! Despite its age, the original Diablo for the PS1 is still a lot of fun to play. While it's a million miles away from the very best way to play it these days, the game hasn't aged a day where it really counts, proving there were several different types of RPGs that made a legendary splash on Sony's legendary console. Hey, did you know that Diablo was actually also meant to come to the Game Boy Color at one point? Check out Uncle Derek talking about it over on his channel. Don't worry, he's the good kind of uncle, not the kind that, puts you under the stairs for like 15 years. Number 19, Brave Fencer Musashi. Remember when Square was doing cool stuff like Brave Fencer Musashi and not silly nonsense bollocks like doubling down on something as awful as NFTs? A game many no doubt took a chance on because it came with a demo of Final Fantasy VIII, Brave Fencer Musashi may prove to be a little too light on the RPG elements for some, but we love its basic genre elements being married to some of the most satisfying action in the console's entire library. Furthermore, those action game touches require a more methodical approach than you might get with other action RPGs on the PS1. Brave Fencer Musashi is a pretty unique experience unto itself, offering a strong narrative and world alongside touches of humour and genuinely moving drama. It's also one of few JRPGs of the time to offer voice acting. The gorgeous pre-rendered backgrounds and addictive gameplay made for a pretty brilliant experiment from Square, and at least we got one sequel in 2005 for the PS2, a game in which the main character's hair is about as unnecessarily long as The Irishman. Number 18, Wild Arms. An early JRPG release in the PS1's life cycle, Wild Arms has become a little obscured by the mass of games that came immediately after it, including Final Fantasy VII. That's surprising, given that this game spawned several sequels as well as one of those Japanese animes, with the most recent entry hitting the PSP in 2007. Maybe we're way past overdue for a remake or even just a brand new game. It only takes a few minutes of playing Wild Arms and its completely unique setting and feel to remember why it was so engrossing to begin with. Wild Arms features a pretty simple combat system, but the differing ways your three main characters learn their abilities is one of the ways the game sets itself apart. Modern weapons like rocket launchers exist alongside traditional JRPG staples like swords. When you combine the unique leveling up system with the game's high difficulty in its dungeons, puzzles, and the surprisingly high encounter rate, you're left with a Wild West infused adventure that takes your hero Rudy across the vast wilderness of Filgaia. We've not seen a full fat entry in the Wild Arms series since Wild Arms 5 on the PS2 in 2005, and while it's still wild, pun lightly intended, that we even got 5 games from a series that has never been a household name, we want more. There's actually a second Wild Arms game on the PS1, but Number 17, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Symphony of the Night is straight up just one of the best PS1 games of all time and just one of the best games ever made. There's simply no denying that. The only reason why it isn't further up our list is because there are other games on the OG PlayStation that better represent the traditional RPG experience. But as far as action RPGs are concerned, Symphony of the Night is one of the best of its kind. The first Castlevania game to introduce serious RPG elements in the first place, Symphony of the Night puts players in the role of Dracula's son, Alucard. You've arrived at the castle of your father, and you're going to get some answers while exploring labyrinthian environments, battling a variety of monsters, and earning enough experience and power to find the missing Richter Belmont and destroy Dracula once and for all. I'd be pretty mad at my dad as well if he had just flipped his name around for me. Imagine if I called my son Image or Samaj. Actually, jot that down. There's one of the franchise's greatest ever stories being told here, depth within the profoundly challenging obstacles and enemies, and some of the best 2D graphics ever developed. Symphony of the Night is a masterpiece through and through. Number 16, Breath of Fire 3. Both Breath of Fire 3 and Breath of Fire 4 are among the best PS1 RPGs of all time, but with room for only one of them on this ranking, we'll give the nod to Breath of Fire 3. Its sprawling narrative is one of the best stories ever created for an RPG, and the characters are so likeable it's easy to want to follow them to the end. Picking up with the story of Ryu and his efforts to learn more about his people, the Brood, no not them, of which he is the only one remaining, Breath of Fire 3 represented a culmination of an epic, fantastic plot. Returning to Ryu gave Breath of Fire a deeper connection to its past entries, and it's something that more RPG series should do. Featuring pretty good voice acting for the time and graphics that are still awesome in that timeless way, Breath of Fire 3 also has great characters beyond Ryu. There's a sense of fun in this game that comes through in its aesthetics, gameplay, and ultimately in its powerful ending. It's really past time that we got a new Breath of Fire game, Capcom. Number 15, Star Ocean: The Second Story. Star Ocean: The Second Story made a bigger meal than most out of its side quests, offering a unique and engrossing private action system that allows characters to diverge from the main quest in odd little solo adventures. It adds further depth to a game that already lets you choose between two characters, Claude or Renner, and offers some 80 different endings. No, that's not a mistake, 80 different endings. There's a variety of different skills to learn as well, including cooking, writing, and making medicine. The real-time combat is also super fun, with plenty of different ways of building your characters up over time, and figuring out the best synergies for combos is as much fun as it is in something like Tales of Arise. In short, Star Ocean: The Second Story is really awesome in every way that matters to an RPG. There's a remake for the PS4, PS5, Nintendo Switch and PCs if you want to discover for yourself why The Second Story is one of the many PS1 RPGs that deserves a little more love. That goes for Star Ocean in general really. It may never achieve absolutely gigantic success, but those who love it know exactly why they do. Number 14, Grandia. A lot of RPGs feature children who don't particularly feel like they're actually children. One of the many ways Grandia, originally released on the Sega Saturn before getting a PS1 release in 1999, feels like a refreshing change of pace from many similar titles of the era, is in how its young characters truly feel young. Justin is a young adventurer who dreams of exploring the uncharted parts of a world that insists there aren't any. Fina is a heroic young woman with her own aspirations. This is a considerably more light-hearted story than many of the PS1 RPGs we've already discussed, and that's reflected beautifully in the vibrant, energetic world in which Justin and Fina travel. There's an enthusiasm here that really connects you to the plot and characters. However, Grandia also offers a pretty stiff challenge, particularly when it comes to its final boss. Thankfully, the game's combat system, a riff of sorts on the ATB system of Final Fantasy, at least gives you an even playing field. If you want to find out just how good Grandia is, the recent remastered collection of the first and second games for modern systems might be just what you need. Number 13, Final Fantasy Anthology. While collections and compilations are normally disqualified from our rankings, this was after all the game that finally brought Final Fantasy V, aka the SNES Final Fantasy game that only Japan got to Western audiences and beyond. With its job system and extremely difficult degree of challenge, Final Fantasy V was on every RPG fan's wishlist, and Anthology finally made it possible to play without going to a fan translation. Plus, on top of Final Fantasy V and its story of Bart and his friends protecting the 4 elemental crystals from a madman sorcerer named Exdeath, he sounds nuts, guys. Anthology also included the essential classic Final Fantasy VI. Fans had already played this on the SNES, but it was nice to see the last 2 SNES entries get a PS1 release with new CGI openings and endings, and some of the most infuriating loading times in the history of the console. Also, complete emotional devastation. The wait for Final Fantasy V, however, was truly worth it, and that's why Final Fantasy Anthology deserves our affection. Should we have included it though, considering it is a compilation? Do you disagree, agree? Let us know down below. Number 12, Dragon Warrior 7. Starting from the point in which you are a young boy living in a small town on the island of Esthard, Dragon Warrior 7 takes you on a long journey to simply complete the main storyline of this truly epic game, which is the only Dragon Warrior aka Dragon Quest title released for the original PlayStation. You'll need around 100 hours. That's maybe intimidating, especially when you get over 30 and time is like jelly, but Dragon Warrior 7 makes the time fly by. The relatively straightforward, turn-based combat mechanics of the game may prove too simple for some who are more used to the speed of modern JRPGs, but there's far more challenge and strategy to carrying these heroes on their massive adventure than you might think. The game really shines in its deep story, as well as in its exploration and world building. Artwork and character designs by the late Dragon Ball creator Akira Toriyama gives us vivid, captivating characters to drive through the game's job system and lengthy, unforgettable quest. And once you've completed it, you've got like another 10 life-consuming RPGs to catch up on too. Have fun! Number 11, The Legend of Dragoon. At this point, you can see just how massively packed for RPGs the PS1 was between 1999 and 2001, and even Sony themselves saw some serious potential in the genre when they developed and published The Legend of Dragoon as a direct competitor to Square's Final Fantasy series. Clearly, a lot of time and money went into the production of this game, which emphasises a massive time-consuming quest, beautiful graphics, and gorgeous cutscenes and music. There's something pretty grand about all of this right out the gate, and while it's obviously a little aged around the edges today, it's still easy to see how wild this would have been back in 1999. Playing as lead protagonist Dart, players who prefer a medieval fantasy world for their RPGs will be very pleased with what The Legend of Dragoon brings to the table. You're also going to love the CGI cutscenes and challenging, complex, and above all else, fun gameplay and combat system. Legend of Dragoon didn't quite unseat Final Fantasy, but it gave players yet another exceptional RPG that is a lot better than what critics gave it credit for. Number 10, Parasite Eve. Another extraordinary variant on the classic RPG formula from Square. And by extraordinary, we mean actually extraordinary. This is one weird, surreal Ars RPG. Parasite Eve and its story of a young police officer named Aya getting caught up in some serious body horror business has been called a compromise between Final Fantasy and Resident Evil. While it's true that the game combines RPG characteristics with some of the grisliest survival horror witnessed on the PS1, because holy shit does this game have an opening animation for you freakazoids out there, it would be categorically untrue to even suggest that Parasite Eve is merely a collection of parts from other games. With a strange, mysterious connection to the mitochondria that's turning residents of New York City into horrible mutants, Aya has a difficult task in front of her. You'll find yourself drawn to learning more and more while also enjoying the combat that allows for freedom of movement with turn-based strategy. Parasite Eve got a good, not entirely great sequel in 1999, followed by a third and presumably final bonkers installment in 2010 for the PSP that many people didn't even know happened. This game never even came out in Europe, by the way, just the second game for some weird reason, and that ain't right. Let's get a remaster at least, guys, come on. Number 9, Luna Eternal Blue Complete. After a successful remake of Luna Silver Star Story for the PS1, Working Design set their sights on giving the same elaborate treatment to its sequel. Luna Eternal Blue features more of the same humour Working Designs love to put in their localization efforts, which gets a little tiresome at times for some people, but you can't deny the game looks, sounds and plays beautifully, providing considerably more challenge than the previous installment with a much bigger story featuring protagonists Hiro and Lucia, whose adventures will encompass centuries of lore and even harken back to characters from the first game. Everything about Eternal Blue feels much more expansive than its old school exterior might suggest. Luna Eternal Blue Complete is still very much an old-fashioned RPG, given that it was originally made for the Sega CD several years earlier, but charming heroes, distinctive villains, and some extremely difficult dungeons all conspire with these lovely sprites to create a definitive example of RPG comfort food. Number 8, Final Fantasy VIII. Our first mainline Final Fantasy game had the unenviable task of following up a game-changing blockbuster called Final Fantasy VII, whatever that is. Square went for broke on their biggest JRPG to that point, with a story of love, war and time travel that certainly felt like an even bigger universe and story than its predecessors. While some elements of the game can be frustrating to say the least, and though some found the game to be a bit less essential than its pretty underrated predecessor, there's no question that Final Fantasy VIII is the sort of game you'll have to experience for yourself. Telling the story of a teenage soldier named Squall, Final Fantasy VIII once again offers a plethora of strong protagonists and antagonists in a truly immersive, lush world. The junction mechanics of the combat system can take a moment to get used to. The game in general has a steeper learning curve than you might be expecting as well. Even so, if you're still playing Final Fantasy VIII after the first mission and after meeting the truly brilliant supporting cast, then it's safe to say that you're going to be there until the very end. As long as you can tear yourself away from Triple Triad, of course. Number 7, Vagrant Story. Name a more iconic couple. This list and Square whippers. However, here's a whipper that feels like being in a cult to be a fan of. An action RPG that's never really received its full due, the game received good reviews and sold well in its first couple of months, but it was also a game some found too different from the genre norms to enjoy. Vagrant Story was also overshadowed by other titles, including several from its own developer and publisher. It's a true cult favourite that didn't deserve to get lost in the shuffle. Why do some consider Vagrant Story to be among the best PS1 RPGs of all time then? There's several reasons, ranging from its awesome late 90s Square soundtrack to its complex story involving magic and espionage to its sometimes absurd levels of difficulty. Really, it just felt like something totally different, and the game certainly speaks to a certain breed of fans. The weapon customization options for lead character Ashley Roy alone can keep you occupied for dozens of hours and several playthroughs. Vagrant Story is a seriously innovative, aesthetically clever and deeply addictive dungeon crawler that is probably way overdue for at least a remaster. Not least because my original PS1 disc is now absolutely battered. What happened to it? Number 6. Xenogears. Xenogears is on a quest to see just how much text you're willing to read in an RPG. For primarily this reason, it's easy to see why this overwhelmingly dense RPG about killing gods, Jungian psychology, and giant robots doesn't quite work for everyone. No game in the PS1 era has a narrative quite like Xenogears, which begins with the adopted Fei Fong Wong in the village of Leihan and ends with you trying to prove that love can make you independent of God himself. Xenogears has touches of fantasy RPG mechanics with a bizarre story seeped in political intrigue and religious confrontation. So prevalent are this game's religious themes that it almost didn't get a release outside of Japan. But we're glad it did, with a challenging but satisfying ATB combat system, unforgettable characters, and one of the most creative, if not fully realised stories ever crafted for an RPG. Oh, and the soundtrack is filled with immersive bangers. Xenogears has its shortcomings for sure, but those pale in comparison to its ambition and how extraordinarily close it gets to perfection for something so deeply frickin' weird. Number 5. Chrono Cross. Chrono Cross is a truly impressive effort to do something different with a second game. With some surprisingly deep and important connections to Chrono Trigger, this tale centers on a young boy named Serge, not that one, who finds themselves slipping into an alternate dimension where he died long ago. It's an absolutely fascinating hook for an adventure, and only gets more interesting as it goes on. Of course, the main marketing point for Chrono Cross was the ability to add over 40 characters to your party. Simply collecting them all is a game unto itself, but if you don't particularly care about doing that, you've still got an RPG with an excellent story of parallel dimensions, a challenging elemental-based combat system, and the unique design touch of a stamina bar that factors heavily into your strategies. If you want to play Chrono Cross today, you may be tempted to go for the version that finally brings Chrono Cross together with the 1996 Satellaview text adventure game Radical Dreamers. Unfortunately, the port itself leaves a lot to be desired. But if you want to connect the dots as much as humanly possible without dipping into emulation, it's perhaps your best bet. Cough cough cough, emulation is actually very straightforward, cough cough cough, coughing sounds. Number 4. Final Fantasy Tactics. While Final Fantasy Tactics benefited slightly from coming out after and being slightly connected to Final Fantasy VII, the game itself is why it was an immediate and resounding hit with a growing number of RPG fans outside of Japan. Tactics provided players with the best of everything one expects from a tactical RPG, including the bottomless complexities of managing your army in a turbulent world of war and fortune. Combat is immediately accessible yet filled with enough depth to keep you challenged for dozens of hours. This is a game that got many into this RPG subgenre to begin with. There's also a deeper story here than in many tactical RPGs, with players assuming the role of Ramza during the Lion War, an event which will eventually include your local church trying to bring back what they at least think is God. It's heavy stuff in the best Final Fantasy narrative tradition possible, but there's still a fantastic combat system, deep player customization potential, and a variety of different approaches to the entire game itself. Final Fantasy Tactics for some is the best Final Fantasy game of all time, and for others there are few tactical RPGs that equal its intricacies and idiosyncrasies. My child brain was too small for this growing up, but now that I am quite old, it's a whipper. Give it another shot if you haven't. Number 3, Suikoden 2. Suikoden 2 suffered a bit in the wake of Final Fantasy VII's release, to the point where everything from its story to its graphics was sometimes unfavourably compared to what is actually a very different RPG from this Konami franchise that we really wish would make a big comeback with a new mainline game. Suikoden 2 for many is the ultimate unsung RPG hero of the PS1 era, and it's hard to argue with that. The characters and story alone, with 107 recruitable characters across a plot that covers a brutal and bloody war between two nations, makes Suikoden 2 a lengthy playing experience. The story involves controlling the protagonist Ryu, who escaped from a murder plot with friend Jowie and adoptive sister Nanami. Not that one. However, the war will soon put these characters on a dark, complicated road to an incredible showdown between two friends whose conclusion is dictated by your choices. Suikoden 2 also has everything you'd ever want from a combat system, with traditional turn-based RPG battles alongside one-on-one duels or massive battles between large-scale armies. This is an absolute classic of the genre. Number 2, Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII really doesn't need an introduction, does it really? One of the most significant releases in the entire PS1 library, the game was then and now considered a major turning point in Sony's rapid rise to the top of the console mountain. The story of Cloud Strife, his super haunted past, and the friends he made along the way is still considered one of the best RPG narratives ever committed to a game, with strong themes that rallied against corporations and environmental destruction, yet still didn't lose humour or characters that made everyone you met in this game a little bit special. Final Fantasy VII proved the audience for RPGs beyond Japan, and did so by adding literally millions of fans to its ranks. And the thing is, from its materia-based magic system to its iconic visuals and suitably emotional, evocative soundtrack, this is another classic that hasn't aged where it really matters. Even if you think the graphics are a little too blocky for modern tastes, it nevertheless amounts to an aesthetic and visual tone that draws you in every single time. Final Fantasy VII proves that, because people are still playing and loving the original today, even with a big shiny trilogy of remakes currently underway. However, it doesn't have this absolute Sigma Chad in it, so the only clear winner when it comes to the best PS1 RPG of all time has to be number 1, Final Fantasy IX. I will not be beaten by a stupid f***ing piece of string. Final Fantasy IX beating 7 might be annoying for some, but the thing about Final Fantasy on the PS1 is that they simply did not miss. Every single one counts among the greatest, most influential RPGs of all time. It's just that we enjoyed this trip through Gaia slightly more than the others. The development team for Final Fantasy IX, led by director Hiroyuki Ito, had to cover a lot of ground to cement the end of a truly remarkable era in spectacular fashion. With a story set in a world in which technology and magic and some serious steampunk vibes cooperate in a manner never explored in this fashion in a Final Fantasy release before, the game succeeded brilliantly. Final Fantasy IX brings the PS1 RPG run to a delirious, satisfying and bittersweet conclusion. The winning formula for Final Fantasy IX comes down to its decision to stick with a more traditional job class system and ATB foundation for the combat, but once again the developers found ways to be creative within the details of those features. Your equipment is what helps you learn various abilities, and there are a lot of different ways to use that to build your ideal party. Finally, the game's beautiful art style is perfectly suited to its endlessly likeable characters, including Zidane the Thief, Garnet the Princess, Vivi the Black Mage, and of course everyone's favourite stressed out Captain of the Guard in Steiner. FF9 may just have the most affable Final Fantasy cast ever. Final Fantasy IX opted for something breezier, yet with all of the deeper possibilities you'd come to expect from a Final Fantasy game, and while its predecessors might get more attention, this is the best PS1 RPG ever as far as we're concerned. And that was our video going over the very best PS1 role-playing games of all time. What did we miss? What was too high? What was too low? Be sure to let us know down below in the comments down below. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures, and thank you for watching.